Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope I can actually live up to your praise. Now, let's see. Okay, here is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I should say first, in fact, I should have said before this, thanks to the Me Too Foundation for giving me the opportunity to come to Singapore I got here in early January, and I'll be leaving in the middle of next month, teaching a course in a seminar in Buddhist philosophy in the philosophy department at Seoul National University, which has been a wonderful experience for me. I've really, really enjoyed it. But also giving this is the second of two public lectures. And I have to thank Pomitze for facilitating the second of the lectures. The first was at the Buddhist Library. The Me Too Foundation was kind enough to specify that these lectures be public lectures. They didn't actually call them Dharma talks, but that's what they really are. They are the sort of thing that a Dharma preceptor gives to lay audiences in order to help them develop their Buddhist practice and stay on the Buddhist path. That's what a Dharma talk is. Now, I don't feel qualified to actually give Dharma talks, but that's more or less along those lines what I'm going to be doing today. And Dharma talks are not supposed to be, even though they're supposed to be helpful or useful, they're not supposed to be fountains of financial advice. And the title certainly sounds like that's what I'm going to be talking about. And what I really want to address, though, is a problem that faces Buddhists today. I understand Buddhists here in Singapore are very concerned about this problem, but I've seen the same thing in Korea and Japan, where I've both taught and lived. And I see similar sorts of problems arising with other major religions elsewhere in the world. What I'm going to be talking about today is a way of perhaps addressing this problem of disaffiliation. Young people renouncing the religion that their family has always practiced, the religion that they were indoctrinated into in their youth. They get to adolescence and early adulthood, and they just say none of the above. And they become what are in the United States now called nonists, none of the above. When asked to check the box for your religious affiliation, none of the above is the box that they will check. This is a problem that infects all of the major world religions today. And why might that be? Well, the first question to ask is, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about a religion? It's on. Is that any better? Yeah, okay. Well, can everyone hear me? Can anyone hear me now? That's better. Good. Thank you. Religions, scholars of religious studies say are ways of addressing three B's. Beliefs, which is the things that we look to religion for when we are bothered by these perennial questions of what's this all about? What am I here for? What's the point? What happens to me when I die? Those sorts of questions. And we expect a religion to have answers to those sorts of questions, answers that we might not expect to get from other sources of authority. So that's one of the three B's. The second of the three B's is belonging. feeling a sense of community. And by the way, NUS, the Chinese library at NUS just put up a new exhibit that's all, the title of the exhibit is One Village, One Temple. And what it's all about is current research being done into the temples in the Kapong that were destroyed through the development of the HDC scheme. And it's really, really interesting. And one of the things it brings out quite nicely is all the ways in which those temples in each individual village gave the members of that village a sense of community through all sorts of ways. Now, in many cases, the inhabitants of those villages all came from the same part of the mainland. And so it was a way of connecting with people who spoke your local dialect and in fact have been distantly related to you. And those sorts of things helped foster a sense of community, but the temple became a site for celebrations that helped cement that feeling of community. So that's something that we look to for a religion, from a religion. But then there's also behavior, that is a code of conduct that we all are supposed to follow. And we look to religions to be sources of moral teachings. What are the moral rules? What do we expect good, upright people to behave like? Okay, so those are the 3 B's. Now, the problem, and it's a problem that, as I said, seems to face all major religions today, is one that comes from the first of those B's, the beliefs. And it comes out of this clash between a modern worldview that's informed by our scientific understanding of how the world works and some of the beliefs that are part of the answers that traditional religions have given. And consequently, young people say, what do you mean life after death? What do you mean the universe is only 10,000 years old? What do you mean there was no such thing as evolution? There were never any dinosaurs. Those are the sorts of obvious difficulties that young people have accepting these beliefs that for many religious traditions, in fact, are central to their own worldview. And once you give up on those, these young people will wonder, well, in fact, isn't this all superstition? And so maybe the festivals are fun around the temple, but the moral teachings, I can ignore the ones that get in the way of my living the kind of life I want to live, and which is, of course, something on the minds of young people. Now, in the West, in recent times, Buddhism has seemed attractive to many of these nonists, many of these people who abandoned whatever religion they were raised in, be it Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, and increasingly in India now, Hinduism, that when this phenomenon of disaffiliation happens, but they still feel the need to find some answers to life-perplexing problems and questions, they often think Buddhism might be a good place to go because it doesn't have, for instance, the idea of a creator God who created the universe 10,000 years ago. So there really weren't ever any dinosaurs, et cetera, et cetera. That was all fake news. Well, there is, in fact, one little stumbling block in this way of trying to look to Buddhism for an answer that the mainstream Western monotheism seemed to flunk on. Because the doctrine of karma and rebirth looks to be incompatible with the modern scientific outlook. If I will, in fact, be reborn as some sort of creature, and if I did lots of good deeds in this life, then I will be reborn into very pleasant circumstances. If I did lots of evil deeds in this life, I'll be reborn into lots of very unpleasant circumstances. If that's the case, well, that doesn't seem like it fits with this naturalistic, scientific, modern worldview, okay? And so that seems to be a problem, and it may well be one of the difficulties that young people today who were raised in a family that considers itself Buddhist wind up disaffiliating from Buddhism, because this likewise seems to be a stumbling block on the side of the beliefs you are expected to accept on if you were to call yourself a Buddhist. And so the question is, does this lead to what I call Dharmageddon, or what the Japanese call Mappo? I apologize, I don't know the Chinese readings of those characters. Well, what I want to suggest is that there may be a way around this problem, a problem of quote unquote naturalizing this idea of karma and rebirth, making it compatible with the naturalistic worldview. But in order to do that, we will probably need to back up and look at some of the most basic, most fundamental teachings of the Buddha himself. I'm not going to go into developments in Buddhist philosophy in schools like Theravada and Sautrantic and Vaibhashika, not going into the teachings of the Mahayana schools or the Vajrayana or Tantric systems. I'm just going to be talking about what scholars call early Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha himself as found in the Nikayas and the Agamas. Now, core teachings in those texts are, number one, the three marks of existence, and number two, the four noble truths, the truths that the nobles, the Aryas, must have realized. And the three marks of existence are everything is characterized by suffering, impermanence, and non-self. And those are absolutely crucial to the Buddhist teachings. We'll get to why exactly. I'm sure we all are familiar with the Four Noble Truths. And the first is that there is suffering. Duh, we all know that. Second is that suffering arises due to causes. And here, this idea is in fact spelled out in terms of exactly how the causal process works that leads us to suffering. And suffering is, of course, the issue, the problem that brings people to Buddhism, and that Buddhism claims to be able to solve. It does that through first analyzing how that causal process works that leads to the origination of suffering. Because if you know the cause of suffering, you know how to make that suffering stop. And that's exactly what the fourth noble truth details, is exactly what steps you need to go through in order to achieve nirvana, which is understood as the cessation of suffering. But now, the second truth traces the occurrence of suffering to ignorance. That's the first cause in this causal series that leads up to, at the 12th step in this 12-linked chain, it's ignorance. Ignorance of what? Well, of the three marks, the three characteristics of existence. It's because we ordinary unenlightened people don't understand that all existence is characterized by suffering, impermanence, and non-self, that we encounter suffering. But now, obvious question, what exactly did the Buddha have in mind by suffering? Well, here's a slight deviation, and here's where the title of my talk comes in. Are we all familiar with a Ponzi scheme? Anyone be brave enough to raise your hand if you're not really sure exactly what a Ponzi scheme? Okay, good. So that I won't skip this slide. Okay, suppose I got a whole bunch of money I don't need to use right away, and I'd like to invest it, get some return on that money. We live under capitalism after all, and that's what capitalism is all about, putting your money to productive uses, your capital. Okay, now I've got friends who say they have in fact had a very good experience invested their money, giving it to this guy, Mr. P, who is a very, very savvy investor. And he has invested their money and given them a great return. So every month they look in their balance sheet and in fact it's gone up. The amount of money they initially invested is now increasing, it's rising greatly, and that's great. Now I look into Mr. P and I compare the returns that he promises with returns from other investments, like for instance, US Treasury bonds, which right now are going down because, well, we know why that is. And I decide this is in fact the best way for me to use my money. So here's the heart of the problem. What Mr. P has actually been doing is he took my money, the money I gave him to invest, and he didn't invest it. He took some of it for himself, and the rest of it he put into the accounts of my friends, but marked those additional sums as their returns this month. Okay? So what he's doing is taking my money and then using it to reward the earlier quote unquote investors in his scheme. Now, as things go on, for at least a few months, other people are going to invest with him after me because maybe I've told people about my good experience with Mr. P and his scheme. And my friends have too, and so other people give Mr. P their money. And so for at least the first few months, I am going to look at my balance sheet and lo and behold, it's gone up. Great. I'm making potloads of money. We know, though, what's going to happen eventually. The scheme is going to collapse. Why is that? Well, what would be required in order for that scheme to go on indefinitely? Given that none of the money actually gets invested in stocks or bonds or any other investment item, what would be required? There would have to be infinitely many people, infinitely many suckers who would give Mr. P their money. And, each time they gave him their money, that money got, in fact, some of it taken by him and some of it distributed to the other investors. But in fact, it would have to be even more and more new suckers at each point, because there are more and more people who need to earn that great attractive return on their investment. And we know that there are not infinitely many people who are going to invest with Mr. P. There are lots of us on Earth right now, but not infinitely many. So now, here's the question. How could my life be like a Ponzi scheme? something that will inevitably collapse, and in collapsing lead to a great deal of unhappiness, a great deal of bad stuff. Well, first question is, when we are sitting around as teenagers, as young adults, thinking about how we want our lives to go, what are we looking for? Well, in fact, we want our lives to be meaningful. We want our lives to be good, that is, to be happy. We want happiness. That's what we're looking for. Now, happiness is to be distinguished from pleasure. I mean, sure, young people like pleasure, they really enjoy it, but pleasure is really simple. It's something you get when your sense organs come in contact with a pleasant stimulus, okay? You feel pleasure. I love mango ice cream. And when I taste mango ice cream, that first taste, the ice cream comes in contact with the taste buds in my tongue, I get a jolt of pleasure. And there's no questioning what that is. It's a simple thing. In fact, in Buddhist metaphysics, pleasure is one of those simple entities that it's just, when it's there, you know it, and end of story. There's no analyzing it. You know it when you feel it, but you couldn't describe it. It's just, it feels good. That's all. Happiness is different from that, because happiness involves this feeling that my life is going well. That's what that young person is looking for. They want their lives to go well. They want to be a good life. What do we mean by a good life? A life in which I can look at my current situation and see it as saying good things about who I am, where I came from, and where I am going. That is, I want my life to be meaningful. And in order for my life to have meaning, it has to have an indefinite future. It has to go on indefinitely into the future. And this is where the analogy with a Ponzi scheme comes in. Because what do we know about my life? It doesn't have an indefinite future. Just as there are not infinitely many investors to give their money to Mr. P, so there is not an indefinite number of life events that is the future of this life. Okay? That's the problem we run into. And that's where this idea of, okay, what is it that we want religions for? Well, we look to religions for answers to life's perplexing problems, and this is one of them. How can my life be meaningful if my life has an end? And that's where doctrines like survival of death and the doctrine of the soul is something that continues to exist when the body decays, and so on and so forth. That's where those ideas come from as possible answers to that question. And that's where the conflict with what we take ourselves to understand about the nature of the world now, thanks to the role of modern science in our worldview. Now, and this is something that the Buddha addressed, this business of existential dread as something that is built into the ways in which we try to live our lives. The happiness-seeking project as the common sense understanding, the answer to the question, how should I live my life? What should I be? What should I do? Shall I get married, have children, blah, blah, blah. And the Buddha addressed this with his analysis of suffering. But suffering is understood as having three different layers. One is, the first layer is the obvious one. Things like pain, the experience of pain because of something that's happening to my body. And that's something that, in fact, the Buddhist understands we can't avoid. So even people who have attained nirvana, have supposedly attained the cessation of suffering, will still experience physical pain. The Buddha himself experienced physical pain at the end of his life, and that's just simply understood. That's not the sort of suffering that is at work here. The second layer is the layer that's due to impermanence. Remember, 3 marks. One is suffering, the second is impermanence, and the third is non-self. The second layer, impermanence, that's the kind of suffering that we all experience when the things that we like disappear, when they go away, okay? The suffering of loss and the feeling of disappointment when that thing that I so treasured is no longer there. But that's not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is something that's sort of indicated in this story that's often told about how the Buddha, Gautama, came to be a Buddha, because he wasn't a Buddha at birth, even though presumably his birth was attended by all sorts of miraculous events. He might have been a king, and in fact, his father very much wanted him to be a king. And his father talked to a soothsayer who said, here's how you make sure he becomes a king and doesn't renounce the world and become an enlightened sage. You make sure that he never experiences these 4 things: old age, disease and decay, death, and a wandering shramana. It's called an ascetic, someone who has left the life of a householder and gone on to seek the solution to the problem of suffering, okay? And what happens? Well, of course, young Siddhartha, young Prince Gautama, is raised surrounded by nothing but young, healthy people and lives a very, very pleasant life until one day he goes out hunting and he sees an old person. He's never seen an old person before. And then the next day he asks his groom, what's that? Oh, it's an old person. Oh, you mean that something's going to happen to me? I get old like that, wobbling along, cane. Next day, he sees a sick person. Third day, he sees a corpse. And the fourth day, he sees a wandering ascetic who has renounced the householder life and gone out on their own to seek a solution to the problem of suffering. Now, that story about young Prince Gautama is a way of getting at the second layer of suffering, the suffering due to impermanence, the impermanence of this life. But the third layer is one that requires further insight, and it's the insight that Gautama realized when he was sitting in meditation under the Bodhi tree. That was the real enlightenment of, he became a Buddha on that night. And what did he realize? Answer, non-self. And that's the key. Non-self is the key to the Buddha's insight into how you overcome this deepest and most profound sort of suffering, existential suffering. What's the point? Why should I do anything at all? What's this all about? Non-self is the way of dissolving that suffering, because what non-self brings into full illumination, realization of non-self, is that the sense of an I is just a fiction. There is no me here. that sense of there being this me whose life I'm so worried about. How will I make it go? And will I continue to exist after the cessation of this body? That's all based on that false belief in a me, the I sense. And we all have it. We all have it. It's deeply rooted into all of us. Now, standard Buddhist answer is it's deeply rooted in us because we've always thought that way in all of our past lives. But I'm trying to avoid that whole idea of past lives here. We all have that because that's what we are taught to think of ourselves as. And if you think for a moment about how you raise small children, you have to work to get them to identify with not just what's here now in the present moment, but also what was in the past and will be in the future in the causal history of these body parts and these mind parts. The I is just a fiction that we teach our children to accept, learn to identify with past and future stages in this causal series because it turns out to be very useful for all sorts of reasons. I mean, and think about what you need to do in order to convince your son or daughter that they should brush their teeth. That's the last thing they want to do. They want to continue to play their video game. What do you have to do? You have to convince them that, in fact, the child who a year from now will be in the chair of the dentist undergoing painful dental surgery is the same person as the person now who does not want to brush their teeth. Do you really want to, in fact, be that child in the dentist's chair? And the child will often answer, but why should I care about that person? That person isn't me. Me is just the here and the now. Well, in fact, you need to convince the child somehow or other. And many of us know what a struggle that can be. But eventually we succeed, and so we all grow up with the I sense. But that's where the Ponzi, the hedonic Ponzi scheme begins. Okay? That's the basic idea. And that's where the title of my talk came from. Now, the path that the Buddha taught is supposed to be a way of overcoming that sense of a me, learning to see through it as just a useful fiction. Okay. Now, there are a number of habits that reinforce that sense of a me. Some of them involve ways of thinking about a life that is all of these body and mind parts and the ones that produce them in the past and the ones that these in turn will produce in the future, thinking of them all as one thing, me, and thinking of them as what belongs to me, my body, my thoughts, my mind. I'm the one who has those thoughts. I'm the one who has those experiences. I'm the one who controls these body and mind parts. But there are also ways in which we habitually respond to how the world treats us, namely anger and, aversion and desire. Okay, I'm presented with a bowl of mango ice cream. I see it across the table, and what do I want to do? I want to reach out, grab it, and stick some of it in my mouth. Okay, that's desire. Now that response to my environment is a way of reinforcing this sense that I deserve it, I want it, I should get it, reinforcing that I sense. Likewise with aversion, something bad happens to me, and something that you did. I stole my mango ice cream, okay? I get angry. In feeling that anger, what am I doing? I'm reinforcing the sense that I count. I'm more important than other things in this world. And so likewise, desire and aversion, anger and love can reinforce the eyesight. These three things, the belief part and the desire and aversion part, the affective part, are what the Buddha calls the three defilements, the three kleshas, these three vices that we all suffer from and get in the way of seeing through the illusion of the me. And because they reinforce that sense of a me. So what do we do? Well, the Buddha says, start developing habits that counteract those vices. Vices are habits, bad habits. Start developing good habits, virtues. Virtues like what? Well, replace your beliefs about what exists in the world, including me, with better beliefs by doing philosophy. And of course, that's the part of the Buddhist tradition that attracted me, because I do philosophy. For me, it's a lot of fun. But then there's also moral conduct, and this has to do with the behavior part and also the belonging part, because if we all follow the same moral rules, then I have a feeling of kinship with you. We are all on the same wavelength. Okay? So then there's meditation, which is also used in the Buddhist tradition, among other things, to reinforce the kinds of beliefs that you develop through the practice of Buddhist philosophical argumentation. Now, let me talk a bit about moral conduct, the kind of behavior that the Buddhist moral codes are meant to enforce. Okay? The rules of morality according to Buddhism. Why are those supposed to be the right moral rules, the rules that we're supposed to follow? For instance, monks and nuns are not supposed to eat meat. Okay? And in fact, in some cases, not eat onions or garlic either, which is kind of weird, but never mind. Okay, the onions and garlic stuff we can understand as trying to reinforce a sense of belonging. The eating meat part is clearly addressing the question of inflicting pain on other creatures. Okay? And that's why Buddhist monks and nuns are expected to practice vegetarianism. Because what do you get from eating meat? You get a small amount of pleasure. I mean, it does taste good. But in return, that's in return for inflicting a great deal of pain on other sentient beings. So that looks like a bad trade-off. And moreover, what's the basic idea behind that trade-off? Inflicting greater pain so that on others, so that I can have a bit of pleasure. Okay? What's that doing? That's reinforcing this idea that I count. This self is, in fact, somehow center of the universe. It's the most important thing that there is, at least as far as my conduct is concerned. So following that particular rule can, in fact, help us avoid exercising these desires for self-gratification. Likewise, I mean, the moral rule of don't take other people's stuff. don't steal, okay? And why does the child want to take the shiny new toy that another child had just brought to the playground? Why do they want to take it? Because, well, give me pleasure. We need to work on getting that child to recognize that, in fact, just because it would give you pleasure doesn't mean you can have it. It's in fact causing pain in another sentient being. And moreover, it's destroying a sense of community, okay? If they can't trust you, then, are they gonna want to be your friend? And we all want friends. But now, here's the question that all children ask: why should I follow those moral rules? I mean, sure, our community accepts these moral rules, but maybe that's just old-fashioned superstition. Maybe, in fact, we should, if you are an adolescent who likes to read stuff, you read Nietzsche, and you think, well, the moral rules, that's just old-fashioned stuff, and I'm going to be Superman. Well, the standard answer to that question in a Buddhist household would be to this effect: if you don't follow those moral rules, karma is going to get you. That is, you will be reborn in a very unpleasant situation. Even if your bad action, your violation of the moral law doesn't get punished in this life, it will get punished in the future life. So don't do it, okay? And this helps us understand what exactly is going on during those 49 days after the death of a loved one, because it's after 49 days that loved one's, antarbhava it's called, will be reborn, that is, will enter into the womb of some other sentient being and begin their next life. And which womb it enters into depends on the kinds of actions it performed in this life that did not already get their karmic fruit. Okay, and that's why we perform various rituals during those 49 days to try to do good things that generate karmic merit, and then give that merit to the loved one so that to help ensure that they get a better rebirth. Okay, and that's what that's all about. And this is where the whole idea of karma and rebirth fits into the story. But the suggestion is, gee, maybe that's really just for lay followers. Maybe this idea of karma and rebirth is useful for lay people who want to consider themselves Buddhists, and so follow at least some parts of the Buddhist path, but aren't ready yet to devote full time to the enterprise, the difficult enterprise of following the path all the way. And of course, this idea makes a lot of sense if we think to the Buddhist time, 5th century BCE India. Literacy was very, there was very little literacy. Okay, very few people read. And knowledge of the nature of the world was, well, basically dependent on folk stories, what we would now call folk myth, the collective wisdom of the whole society over many, many generations. And of course, many of those beliefs were wrong, we know perfectly well. But in those days, very few people would have been fully prepared to abandon the life of a householder and take on the very difficult task of becoming a monk or nun and following the full path the Buddha laid out. And they would also have had difficulty understanding the Buddha's more philosophical teachings, this analysis of the person into these elements that go to make up what we call a person, when in fact there really is no such thing. So, because of very limited literacy, very limited educational opportunities, the vast majority of people may not have been ready for this, but the Buddha taught this doctrine of karma and rebirth in order to at least help them follow moral rules that would at least begin to diminish their sense of a me. Because when you follow the moral rules, then you are at least recognizing others as just as important as me. Their pleasure and their pain as just as important as my pleasure and my pain. Okay? And that's at least the beginning of dissolving the I sense. Now, I have heard Seoul Buddhist monks, Seoul Korean chant, say that in fact, the karma rebirth idea really is just for lay people. We monks and nuns, we don't believe it. We don't take it seriously. Okay? We know, because we are educated, that there's just one life. And when you die, that's it. Okay? There is no rebirth, even if you're not liberated, even if you have not attained nirvana. You die, that's the end. Okay? We know that. But we still expect lay followers to follow this idea of karma and rebirth because it's useful. Now, of course, that can sound very cynical because it sounds like, of course, what we want our lay followers to do is give us alms that will, in fact, keep the monastic institutions going. Okay? It sounds very cynical in that respect. But I want to suggest a non-cynical reading. And it goes like this. Here's another way to think about it. Think about the idea of karma as a way of suggesting that there is, in fact, retribution for bad conduct. If you harm me in order to make yourself feel good, even if you don't get caught and wind up being punished, you are still going to, if not in this life, in the next life, suffer the consequences, because karmic causal laws are causal laws. They're built into the way that the world works. And this is what makes the whole idea of karma and rebirth so comforting, because it seems to promise that this is, in fact, a just world, that justice will be done regardless. But now, notice something else that belief in karma and rebirth does. It helps us avoid the feeling of anger when someone else does something bad. That's a natural response. And that's exactly what our wanting justice is really all about. We want retribution for wrongdoers, people who do bad stuff. And that desire for retribution is really a desire for revenge. And what's the feeling of revenge? It's a kind of anger. And what's anger? It's one of the defilements. It's one of the things that reinforces the sense of a me. So accepting the karma rebirth idea might be a way of helping individuals overcome anger. But once we see that, we could even see it as itself just a useful fiction. It's not really real, it's just a useful way of thinking about how the world actually works. Maybe there is no rebirth, and so that person who got away with all kinds of bad stuff in this life. They die, that's it. They're not going to go to hell. They're not going to be reborn as a preacher or whatever. Maybe that's just a useful way to think about that almost instinctive feeling of wanting revenge, wanting that evildoer to suffer retribution. You can see this Christian, this is in somewhere in what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call Torah. A justice is mine, saith the Lord. You can see this as perhaps getting at the same point. The idea is God's the one who punishes the evildoers, not necessarily in this life, but certainly in the life to come. Okay. That's what that justice is mine, saith the Lord. But you can also see that rather than God is going to make that soul wind up in hell, you can also see it as a way of getting that the individual who has been wronged to be at peace. Here's an example of this sort of thing, but it had nothing to do with religion, it has to do with the practice of law, the infliction of criminal justice and how that works. Here's a story from a small town in rural Kansas. Whole bunch of farmers. Farmers need a good community bank, so the banker understands their situation and understands that they are good for a loan because farmers always need new capital when it comes springtime and time to plant. So they formed collectively they pooled their money and formed a community bank, and they chose this one particular farmer who knew some stuff about banking, about accounting and finance and all that stuff. They chose him to be the president of the bank. And guess what happened? This person got caught up in a cryptocurrency scam. There, I'm giving you some more financial advice. Don't get caught up in cryptocurrency scams. Okay? Someone tells you they can sell you some cryptocurrency at a very attractive price. They tell you that over your phone, and in fact, it's a scam. And then once you're caught up in that scam, you keep winding up putting more and more in, and then you're running to other people to get them, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And eventually this banker got caught because, in fact, the bank failed. And this obviously harmed all the people in the community. He was charged, he was tried, he was convicted, and then he was sentenced. But then in the United States, we have this peculiar institution of victim impact statements. These are statements that people who were victimized by this convicted criminal, they give at the sentencing phase of the trial, after the person has been convicted. They get to testify as to how they were harmed. Now, I say it's a peculiar institution because it's clearly retributivist. It's all about retribution. It's all about this feeling that these people should get to say all these things in order to make sure that this convicted criminal gets the right kind of punishment. Okay? Now, here's the interesting thing that happened at the trial. After all those other farmers gave their victim impact statements, here's what the judge said. The best thing for you to do is forgive this man. Leave matters of retribution to me. That's my job, and I will see that it is done. Justice is mine, saith the Lord. What's he saying there? Is he saying, I'm angry at that criminal? No. What he's saying is, I'm going to see to it that this convicted criminal gets the right sort of punishment that will prevent this person from doing the same thing again, and will also send a message to other people in our society that they should likewise not fall into the same error. This might be a way of understanding the karma rebirth idea, that in fact it is just a useful fiction. And maybe this is what those Korean monks actually meant when they said, oh, karma and rebirth, that's just for lay followers. So, I've talked enough. Thank you very much. And let's see what you all, what's on your minds.
That's a very intriguing session. I believe you might have some burning questions to ask Prof in regards to rebirth and its application to life or about naturalized Buddhism. Yes, please.
My name is William. If we go vegetarian, how do we maintain the proteins, vitamins, rather than taking supplements?
I'm afraid I didn't really understand. I didn't know what to say.
If I become a vegetarian, how do I get nutrition, vitamins, and necessary proteins, and whatever stuff I need?
Good. Okay. I'm not giving financial advice today, but I will give some dietary advice on what you should eat, because it's true that what human beings get from eating meat are some essential amino acids that are important to our having the protein that we need in order to rebuild our muscle, rebuild our organs. And that's an important part of the typical human diet. And humans have, in fact, generally eaten meat throughout the history of the human species. Not that much meat, but some meat. And it's been an important part of the diet. In order to get all of the essential amino acids that we human beings need without eating meat, there are a couple of things you can do. First of all, many vegetarians also eat eggs. And eggs have most of the essential amino acids, the proteins in that. For obvious reasons, because what's the yolk of the egg? It's the fetus of a chicken. Okay, so it's got all the stuff that you would get from actually eating meat, but without inflicting any pain on any living being. But the other thing you can do is, and this is something that's a part of Tamil cuisine, you can eat a combination of dal and rice. Because dal has one set of amino acids in it, and rice has a different set. You can't get all the nutrients you need just from eating dal. You can't get them all just from eating rice. But you can get all the ones you need from eating those two together. And that's why Tamil cuisine has so many different things that are made from dal and rice. North India, you can do the same thing with dal and wheat. But I love idli and I love dosa. So idli and dosa are just as good for you as eating chicken or fish or even beef.
Thank you, Prof. And Prof, widely, and thank you for your sharing. I just thought that I found the metaphor, of course, of the Ponzi scheme was intriguing. And so related to that, I'm just thinking about when you mentioned I mean, when you explain the whole concept of Ponzi scheme, right? I just thought, just because Ponzi schemes exist doesn't mean that we don't invest, right? Like,
That
for
we don't
example,
what?
Yeah, so
Oh, yeah.
just because like in life, I mean, and in terms of financial advice, right?
Right.
Just because there are Ponzi schemes out there, it doesn't mean that we don't invest, right? So it's still fine to invest, but it's about distinguishing between the Ponzi schemes and sound investments,
Yeah.
right? So likewise, if just to apply that metaphor, if that happiness-seeking project that you described, right? That so say if we were to just look for happiness in the material world, that's the Ponzi scheme. I think that's quite clear. But then, what is the sound investment? So does that mean abandoning the life of the householder? Does that mean it's about aspiring towards renunciation, as you said, like letting go of that I sense, that ego? So what is the best investment in the Buddhist life?
Good. What is it like to see through the I sense? What kind of life can I have if I have come to see that my feeling there is a me inside this puny little head? And that's really the center of the world. That's how I see things, and that's how I feel things. Those are all experiences for me. Once I see through that as just a useful way of talking, there's nothing more than that. It's also a useful way of organizing the events in my life, but it's not really there. Once I've done that, what kind of life can I live? Because you're right that there's got to be some sort of way that I should live my life that isn't like the Ponzi scheme, invested in, pardon that expression, invested in there being an indefinite future. Just like the real Ponzi scheme requires there being infinitely many new investors to be pulled in. Well, maybe it's this. First thing is, okay, morality. What's morality all about? It's all about treating others just as well, no worse than I treat myself. Well, if there is no me, what does that do to morality? Well, it makes morality just something that I should practice with respect to everyone, including me. I should not be especially concerned about my future because there is no me. I should just be concerned about preventing pain and suffering, regardless of when and where they happen. And that's the basic Buddhist ethical foundation. What's morality all about? It's all about preventing pain and suffering as much as I can, as well as I can, regardless of where that pain and suffering is, here or there, now or in the future. Of course, there are going to be lots of occurrences of pain and suffering I can't do much about. I can't do much about the pain and suffering that's being inflicted on Gazans in Gaza, on Palestinians in Gaza right now. I can do something, but very little, okay? There's all sorts of suffering that I don't even know about. And not knowing means I can't do anything, although I shouldn't close my eyes to the suffering that exists elsewhere in the world. I should do what I can. But even in cases like that, what I should do is figure out, first of all, where that suffering is and when it's going to happen. And second, whether, given my resources right now, I can do something to prevent it. Now, I can prevent tooth decay. I can prevent my having another cavity in my teeth that the dentist has to drill out in a year. I can prevent that by brushing my teeth and flossing, okay? So that's something I should probably do. That's one of the things that morality, Buddhist morality, tells me I should do. Now, we You might say, how could that be a moral rule? Brush your teeth and floss. Well, the answer is the moral rules cover everything, everywhere. All pain and suffering, regardless of when and where they happen, are to be prevented. That's the prime directive, okay? Now, once we've got that on board, then we live our lives doing what we can to prevent pain and suffering, but we don't do anything to prevent pleasure. When pleasure does happen, that's great. We're just not worried about it's going to go away, what's going to happen when it's gone. We don't suffer the sort of existential dread that comes along with the I sense. Okay, so that's the answer, I think, following through on the Ponzi scheme metaphor, a Buddhist should give.
Thank you. Yeah, the ethical imperative.
Yeah, can you go to that slide where you talk about the 3 layers of suffering?
This one or the next one?
Yes. Yes, so this is very interesting. I'm just a layperson with regards to my understanding of Buddhism. But I felt like I think the first layer, which you said is pain, physical pain, that's quite easy to understand. The second one you said was the pain that comes from impermanence, or the fear of, or the experience of change. So I'm curious if you elaborate more on the mechanism, so I can understand how it applies to the past, because you said it applies to the past, the present, and the future. So for the past, if I have lost something that I used to be, so maybe like I lose a bodily function and I can't do something that I used to love. If I keep on being attached to this image of myself, then I keep creating more suffering because I'm comparing myself now to the past. So that's one of the ways that the change creates pain. And by comparing to the past, so how does it apply to, let's say, the future?
I'm not sure I caught all of your question. The last part.
So how does it apply to the future? The fear of, not fear, but the pain that comes from impermanence and change.
Okay, it sounds to me like you're actually going up and down, going from the second layer to the third layer and then back down to the second layer, which a Buddhist would be perfectly happy with. Sorry. A Buddhist would be perfectly happy with that oscillation because, in fact, the I sense is operative at all 3 layers. It's just at the third layer that we get to full-blown, what we call existential suffering. The suffering that expresses itself as feelings of frustration, alienation, despair, pointlessness, meaninglessness, etc. The second layer is a little less existential in nature, but it obviously does involve the I sense because I used to have this thing, I loved it, and I'm looking all over the house, I can't find it anymore. Where is it? It's gone. Pain, okay, suffering. And that's suffering that the Buddhists would describe as suffering due to conditions, they said, which is to say, due to causes. Everything that does exist exists due to causes, but that also means everything that exists will sooner or later go out of existence. And that's the impermanence that the Buddha is talking about with the second mark. And the suffering that impermanence causes can be more than just the immediate feeling of, oh, that hurts. It hurts no longer having it. That's pain. But it can also have that emotional penumbra, that emotional complexity of at least disappointment, if not a feeling of, gee, what does this, if I lost that, what's next? What else am I going to lose? Where's this all going? And that can take us down to that deeper layer of suffering. The Buddha's basic point with all of this is suffering is something that we ordinarily are ignorant about because we think if you play your cards right, if you manage your life properly, you can live a good life, a happy life. And what the Buddha claims with this noble truth, the first noble truth of suffering, is that that's false. It's just simply built into the way that the world works, and that suffering is just in the cards. It's going to happen. Okay.
More questions?
Yeah, why don't you?
There's one question.
Just now you mentioned that rebirth is a permanent item in the rebirth, the cycle of rebirth. So how would people believe and not believe in rebirth affect their learning or maybe their attitude towards Buddhism or towards Buddhist studies?
How could it affect what?
Yes, like for someone who believes in rebirth and for the other person who don't believe in rebirth, how would their spiritual practice be different?
If you are a Buddhist, see, what I'm trying to do is suggest, excuse me, what I'm trying to do is suggest you can be a good Buddhist and not believe in rebirth. That it's not a necessary part of what it means to be a Buddhist. It might be useful, but these Korean monks that I've been talking to would say it's just a useful myth. You can do that if you understand the Buddha's teachings of karma and rebirth as just a useful device for people who were not yet ready for the full story about where suffering comes from. So, how would a Buddhist who does believe in karma and rebirth and a Buddhist who does not believe in karma and rebirth, how would there be any difference in their behavior? I'm going to suggest no difference. Because whether you believe in karma and rebirth or not, if you do what the path is supposed to do, which is come to see this idea of me as just a fiction, just an illusion, then you are going to get rid of those feelings of wanting justice, wanting revenge on all of those evildoers. I mean, look, the sort of thing that always gets brought up in discussions of whether this part of Buddhism can be naturalized, made compatible with the modern way of looking at the world. The thing that always comes up is examples like some evil person who, in fact, makes lots and lots of money and has, great cars, lots of them, and has houses in all sorts of different parts of the world, and is always seen with attractive mates, and so on and so forth. And they do that on the basis of all of the gains they've gotten by robbing other people, by inflicting harm on other people, okay? And do you really want it to be the case that that person can die happy? That's an argument for karma and rebirth. Well, the suggestion might be that in fact, that person will not die happy. They are going to be just as much subject to suffering as anyone else. In fact, probably more so, because their behavior shows just how strong the I sense is in them, the sense of a me, as the most important thing in the world. And that's what brings on suffering. The stronger that sense is, the more inclined they are to suffer. Now, they may not show it, but okay, I'm going to go into a little bit of politics here. The case of Donald Trump. Donald Trump might look like someone who is, at the top of the world. But what do we know about Donald Trump? Well, you look at his face, and so often there's a very angry scowl on that face. Moreover, what do we know from his behavior? Well, he's always posting stuff on social media. There's rants against people he thinks are his enemies. And when are those rants posted on social media? At 3 o'clock in the morning. Donald Trump cannot get a good night's sleep. That's how angry he is. And that anger comes from his narcissism. He is the poster child of narcissism. He is the perfect example of extreme self-love. And the self-lover is someone who is going to inevitably experience suffering. So we don't need karma to make sure that Donald Trump gets his comeuppance, okay? That's what I think the sort of Buddhist who wants to naturalize karma rebirth would say. Okay.
Thanks, Prof. Can I just play like devil's advocate on that point, right? Like, if karma and rebirth and the doctrine of karma and rebirth isn't important because ultimately our behavior is the same, but in terms of our motivations, doesn't that influence it significantly? I'm just thinking of like FOMO, like the fear of missing out, right? That a lot of young people have, right? That if we believe that karma and rebirth is true, then there is an infinity of lives ahead in which we could technically have those experiences. So we wouldn't have that fear. And another big fear would be fear of death, obviously, right? But if we don't believe in karma and rebirth, and we believe that death is the end, right? Then technically it is an infinity of experiences that we would, by definition, be missing out on, right? We would, literally not experience that. So isn't that fear and that elimination of that fear through belief in whether or not it's a useful fiction, but through that belief is and can be so important, right? So I'm just wondering how does that square?
Somewhere in the Nikayas, there is a passage where the Buddha is talking to a king who renounced his kingdom and became an arhat. He renounced the householder's life and became a monk and then became enlightened. And people were surprised that he'd done this. And so the Buddha asked him, what was it that led you to renounce your kingship and become a wandering ascetic and come to join the Sangha? And one of his answers, he says a number of things in answer to that question. One of his answers was the thought that when I have gone to my reward, others will enjoy the things that I now enjoy. The fear of missing out. Very nice expression of that. But presumably, he may have, at least at some point, believed in karma rebirth. So what exactly is he missing out on if he will be reborn into a life in which he can have the same sorts of pleasures all over? One of the problems with, what you're getting at is why the doctrine of karma and rebirth is so comforting. because it tends to sound like it should allay our fear of death. It undermines existential angst. However, what do we know about what happens when you're reborn, according to the doctrine? Answer, do you remember anything of your past lives? No. It's starting all over again. Maybe starting all over again as a human being, born into good circumstances or difficult circumstances, maybe being reborn as a god, living a very, very long and very pleasant life. Or maybe being reborn in one of the hells, undergoing constant punishment. But regardless of where you are reborn, according to the doctrine, you don't remember what got you there. Okay? It's only Buddhas, fully enlightened beings, who can, in fact, see what others' karmic histories are and what their karmic futures are. Buddhists can do that. We unenlightened people, even arhats, cannot do that. Arhats can presumably figure out where they were in past lives, but that's it, according to the teachings. So that doesn't sound like it's going to do a whole lot of answering that FOMO, that fear of missing out. So that's another problem. But, and then there's the fact that, I mean, what was the trap that the Buddha set for himself when he only taught karma and rebirth to lay folk? He taught the rest of the Eightfold Path, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths and all the details to monks and nuns. He didn't teach that stuff. He didn't teach non-self to lay people. All he taught them was karma and rebirth. Why? Because he thought they weren't ready for it yet. But in teaching karma and rebirth, what's the most obvious interpretation? I find out I'm going to be reborn. Well, what makes that new being be me? It must be that, in fact, there is some part of me that doesn't get burnt up when this corpse is cremated, but instead goes on and inhabits that new body and that new life. In other words, it leads people to just naturally assume there is a self, there is a real me, and that's a trap. Now, Buddhist thinkers were well aware of that, and that's where the whole business of the two truths comes up. It's very, very complicated, but nonetheless, that is a real trap with that idea. It leads quite naturally to a kind of reinforcement of the I sense. Maybe I don't have to worry about where this is all going, because in fact, it will keep going on and on and on. It can go on forever. Just as there, according to the ideology of karma and rebirth, I have lived infinitely many past lives. I could live infinitely many future lives as well. So cool, I get a new career next time around. Of course, I won't know it's a new career. All I'll know is, well, here I am. Who knows where I came from? And of course, there's the added difficulty that for us, it's very hard to believe that, because that requires believing that the world is actually governed not just by the physical laws, but the moral laws of karma as well. And that's a very hard thing to accept for modern folk.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing today. What you mentioned about narcissism really coincides with my question. You mentioned just now about narcissism. So my question, you mentioned just now about narcissism. Yeah. So it coincides with my question. It's about meditation. So I don't know if you meditate or if you have done some research on this area. Is that we all have to deal with narcissistic and toxic people, like from time to time in our daily lives, right? And the thing is, for myself, I've been learning to meditate, I've been trying to meditate, and I've been taught to watch my anger, when it arises in me. And when we watch it, it will slowly disappear. So the rise and fall of anger. But I realized that when I'm angry, I'm too preoccupied with my anger. Yeah. And I can't watch it. And if I watch it, I see the anger growing. So, and in one of your slides, you mentioned that meditation is a belief. Could you kindly elaborate on why it's a belief? Yeah, so that's one. And because I think meditation is a huge part of Buddhism that helps in our spiritual practice, our spiritual journey. But I'm facing some problems, pertaining to that. So I hope you can share your insights, your take on this. Thank you.
And thank you for bringing out a complexity that I sort of glossed over. Because meditation, I said, is a way of making the beliefs that you develop through the practice of philosophy in the Buddhist path, making those real to yourself. Coming to see them not just as doctrines, as teachings, even if the practice of philosophy has convinced you they're true, they're still just statements, descriptions of how things are. And one of the things you're supposed to do in meditation is grasp non-self, grasp impermanence, grasp it directly in your meditational practice. If you're a Mahayana Buddhist, grasp the emptiness of all dharmas directly in your meditational practice. Now, what exactly that amounts to is hard to say for me because I don't meditate. I'm not a good Buddhist practitioner, not at all. But nonetheless, that's what they claim. It's a way of bringing home in a very concrete way some of these discoveries you make in that first part of the path. But there's more to meditation than just that. It also includes things like the practice of metta, of loving kindness. And what's metta all about? It's all about extending the desire for well-being, wishing a good, happy, pleasant life to the people that I immediately care about, not just me, but my loved ones and maybe even my neighbors and my students and so on, extending that out further and further until it encompasses everyone, all sentient beings. And that's also a meditational practice. It's a practice that's hard to engage in precisely because when it comes to, in my case, the example of Donald Trump, it's hard for me to wish his life to go well. But nonetheless, if I were a good practitioner, I should do that. Now, what's that all about? That's dealing with the defilement, the klesha of anger. And likewise, you can do the same thing through the practice you were describing of in a state of meditational concentration, watching the anger arise, watching it exist for a while and then fall away. Just observing it in a completely objective, impersonal way. That's another way of dealing with this, trying to get rid of that bad habit of feeling anger. Okay? Now, the suggestion is that getting rid of anger is hard. I mean, it's hard because it seems like it's almost built into us. It might, in fact, be instinctive because in our evolutionary ancestry, it might have been the case, probably was, that the early humans who had that reflex when someone stepped on their toes of reaching and lashing out, okay? And maybe having that sort of reflex led to greater reproductive success. And that's how evolution works. And so we wind up inheriting a brain that's wired in that way rather than the, oh, well, that was just, you know, a bozo. He just stumbles around and sometimes he walks on other people's toes, okay? We're not wired like that. Someone steps on my toes, I get honked off, okay? But I need to, if I'm going to realize non-self, I need to overcome that seemingly instinctive response, okay? So it might be I'm going to need a number of different tools to do it. And you're perfectly right that meditation, as you were describing it, is one of the ways to do it. The practice of metta is another, but also this practice of understanding the karma rebirth idea as just a way of outsourcing our anger. Yeah, we want people who harm others to be punished. Why? Because we want these evildoers, these people who harm others in advancement of their own interests, we want them to stop, because that's causing greater overall pain and suffering in the world. And so we need social institutions that will make those people stop. And that's what ideally a criminal justice system would be all about. It would be all about taking people who behave that way and rehabilitating them, not punishing them, not inflicting pain on them just because we're angry at them, but rather just simply making them stop by turning their heads around, okay? So that would be another way of addressing it, by understanding that it's not my job to feel angry, because what's anger really all about? Well, when it's justified anger, it's because these people are causing a lot of harm, not just to me, but to the world, the rest of the world, and wanting that to stop. But it's not my job to, in fact, harm that person to make them stop. In fact, that should be the job of something like an organized society's criminal justice system. Okay.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I think if there's no more other questions, we'd like to end this session. Thank you very much, Professor Siderits, for these very illuminating and thought-provoking sessions. We look for more sessions in the future and welcome you back to Singapore in the future. And thank you very much to the Mito Foundation, to Ming Sir, for allowing us to have this wonderful session today. We look forward to see you again. Thank you very much.